taken a decent distance. So we never know with the government rules, they might change from day to day. Yesterday we thought everything is all right. Today another part of the country is in lockdown, and as a result could be that Queensland receives someone who has coronavirus. Okay. I'm not going to waste my time on current events. We are going into our lesson because this lesson deserves good attention. Why? Because we learn about God, His character, and we learn also about what covenant includes. And as our last part of the lesson says, there are some obligations from our part. An everlasting covenant. We discussed this theme about the covenant and the promise. First promise was made in the Garden of Eden when our first parents sinned. And God had promised that He will put enmity between the seed of the woman and a serpent. And basically He said that one of the woman's seed will come and step on the serpent's head, while his heel will be bruised. And reading the stories from the Bible until Jesus came, we see that God was intent to keep His promise, regardless of how feeble were people in their keeping on their part of the promise. And eventually Messiah did come, and eventually He stepped on the serpent's head. So that was everlasting covenant. But we've learned last week that God formed a special covenant with a special man, one of the kind, who would trust Him, although millions and maybe billions of people didn't. Who was that? Noah. And although it didn't rain, God said that there will be flood. And Noah believed Him and built an ark. But his message was, his part of obligation was not only to build an ark, but also to preach the gospel. And the preaching was going on for how long? 120 years. And it's interesting, we will be touching this subject in our lesson as well, because in case of Noah, it says that Noah found a grace in the sight of the Lord. The same is told about Abraham. Abraham is the main character of our lesson study today, because God talked to him directly and established His covenant with him as well. But it is important to understand this is part of everlasting covenant. That is why it's presented like that. And again, we touch this subject of grace here because Abraham also found the grace in the sight of the Lord. So let nobody teach you that grace is only a new covenant thing. It existed in the Garden of Eden. It existed in Noah's time. It existed in Abraham's time. concept of grace is, how you would describe it? Undeserved favor. And we will see through our studies that God always keeps his side of the covenant. So what is the specific thing God promised to Abraham as he established his covenant with him? He will, yeah. When he promised him that, some 25 years before he got his son. Have you noticed the same thing in previous lesson? God said to Noah, you will get into the ark, and your sons and your sons' wives. That was the promise. How many children did Noah have at that time? 0. Didn't have children. Children were born after. But he believed. And the same thing happened to Abraham. God promises, I will make you a father of many nations. I will multiply you exceedingly. And I marvel, but Abraham believed him. Didn't have any seed of the doubt. And that faith was tested. It wasn't just a statement from Abraham, yes, Lord, I believe. And in our lesson, we will see the 3 stages of that promise that God gave to Abraham. But it is quite interesting to know that every time God came, he came with a new name to Abraham. What does it tell you? We can discuss, you can tell me. Yeah.
I understand that every name presenting new character.
Mm-hmm.
When Abraham fully understand God's grace and accept when he offered his son, the faith was so perfect in God's promise that God called him
Father of many nations. And we have children, so many children have Father Abraham, although Bible mentions 2 by name. And even Apostle Paul in his epistle to Galatians successfully argued that those Christian believers who believe as he preached to them, Jesus Christ, are the seed of Abraham and of Sarah, who was, because that was the child of the promise. The other was a child of the flesh. And if you have time, read that chapter, 4th chapter of Galatians, and find out what was the point of Apostle Paul arguing that we are legitimate children and called to be his sons and daughters. I mean, this is a great thing, that we can call Abraham our father. Why? Because we have the faith similar to him. Let's see what his faith, how was his faith. When first God appeared to Abram, who was he and where he lived? Yeah, yeah. He was basically Babylonian, near the big city of Babylon. And if God didn't call him out of that land and say, come out, and I will give you special land for you and your descendants. Was Abraham young man then? No. Adventurous? I remember when I was 30 and we were called to come to Australia by my wife's brother. And we thought, should we, shouldn't we? And we were adventurous. And our children are thanking us for being so adventurous because, I mean, who knows what would have happened if we stayed there. And but Abraham was, in today's terms, pretty old man. And God called him, and we mentioned his names, which reveal his character. Sometimes he called himself God, Lord Almighty. The other time he calls himself El Shaddai, which means, have you studied that? I mean, no offense if you don't know, but this is a person with unbounded riches. He can give abundantly to everyone and still have plenty in reserve. So this is God who gives. And to Jacob, he presented himself as a Jehovah Jireh. That means provider. He provides everything. And every time we listen to a new name of God in the Bible, we must pay attention because God is telling something about himself we probably didn't know before. Okay, so when God appeared first time to Abraham, as we said, he was in a land of Chaldeans. And what was, I would say, the state of his affairs then? He was married, yeah. And he took his half-sister and for wife. And his father worshipped some other gods. But God called Abraham and promised him Canaan. I don't know if he had the same experience as we did. When we were called to Australia, we couldn't, internet was not available then, you know. And so we tried to learn as much as possible about new country. And how I would say, one specific show came on TV about a soccer coach who was a national coach of Australian soccer team. And he was from part of Yugoslavia then. And he came and explained what Australia is. And I remember first time we watched, and they mentioned the price of strawberries. And we looked at the price, and it was probably 50 times more than we would pay in our... and we said to each other, we will never eat strawberries in Australia. But this wasn't true, you know. When God promises the land of milk and honey, that is really the land of milk and honey, although you haven't seen yet. I don't think that Abraham saw the promised land with his own eyes before he decided, yes, I will go and I will follow what the Lord said. But he did.
The Bible says Abraham didn't know where he was going. He just go.
Some people mention that the city where the Abraham lived before was very developed city, that it had own sewage system and water system. So why would you leave such so-called luxury and for the rest of your life live in tents where every day struggle for water and other necessities would be so apparent? But if we read Hebrews, why Abraham did that. Because he saw the one who is not visible as he have seen him with his own eyes. And the other part of the same chapter in Hebrews says that he was waiting for the city which has foundations. Which city we are talking about? New Jerusalem. Where was old Jerusalem then? Not even built. See, that is type of faith which Abraham had in God. He trusted him that he will deliver what he said. And I don't like comparing people in Bible, but we do not have options here. Can you remember how Noah lived and how Abraham lived? And what God required of one and God required of the other. It says that Noah found a grace in the sight of the Lord. But then it says that Noah walked with God and it was perfect in his sight. And to Abraham, God said, walk before me and be you blameless. Or this is our memory verse. No. One of the verses, anyway, we read that walk before me and be perfect. In some translation you can read that, or walk blamelessly before me. So God wanted people whom he trusted with the truth to live honest lives, to walk before him like their life is exempt. You know, many people in this world don't like that kind of thing, and do not like exams, do not like to be examined at all. I mean, they are not first, they are not last. You know, when Apostle Paul preached the gospel to Felix, who was the judge, and he mentioned the judgment to come. And as soon as he mentioned that, Felix said, okay, I'll call you some other time when I have time. People don't like to hear that their lives will be examined. But are we talking about the reality, or are we talking about fiction? If Bible says that the judgment will come, I believe it will come. Everything what God promises will happen. And again, Abraham trusted God. Second time God appeared before Abraham when he was 90 years of age. So 10 years before Isaac was born. Of course, he didn't know that in 10 years Isaac will be born. He gave up the hope. And Sarah, being a wise woman, convinced him that he should have a relationship with their bond maid and have a son with her, and that will be called his son. And I don't know why Abraham faltered on that point. He could have proven to God and to others and to us as well that he's perfect man, and that he trusts God, everything what God says. But he showed that he has that human nature or falling nature. We all have that. Yep.
Every woman knows how to twist husband up.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's one really interesting aspect of this. If we go
Yeah.
back to chapter 15,
Yes.
Abraham said, "Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir."
Yeah.
So I can't help but think that Abraham was really excited about this idea of having a special son who would then go on. Because it also says in chapter 15 where God said, go your way, you're going to live a good old age and you're going to be buried, but then it's going to happen after you. So part of me kind of thinks Abraham's really looking forward to seeing this son come along, and it's through that son that this prophecy that God had revealed to him is going to take place. And it's almost like Abraham says, when are you going to fulfill the word that you said to me way back then? Look how old I am.
God's got his own timeline.
Yeah. I think that's the whole point.
That's the whole point, because each human being is not only created by specific mother and father, but the timing must be perfect. We often forget that part, timing. And God was just waiting, because he knows, like the Bible says, the end from the beginning. So he saw who will come after Abraham, and that Isaac will be born, the child of promise. And the third time, God appeared to Abraham when he was 99. And that was a strange encounter, because he saw 3 men walking and wanting to pass his property. And yet he ran after them. I admire him for running in 99.
He lived to 145, didn't he?
And he brought them to his tent and prepared a meal from them. And then the leader of that group of 3 men, who we believe is Jesus Christ himself, told that next year at this time the Sarah will have a son. And Sarah heard and started laughing. So much so for the faith.
It's strange how we put human limitations on God.
Yeah. But don't get me wrong. Abraham didn't dwell on that level where he was doubting and so on. Because after a year, Isaac was born from his wife, Sarah, and Sarah was even embarrassed what the people will say. I mean, who cares? God had said, and yeah.
To see a lady of that age pregnant, that would get your attention.
Yeah, definitely.
And God is saying, "I'll establish my covenant with you. I'll establish my covenant with you." It's a phrase that's repeated. The question is,
Yes.
why is it repeated? Because we're thick
Yeah, and we forget.
and we forget.
We've got to understand what covenant means.
Yeah, it's basically contract between two parties, not just one party, and all obligation is on one party, but there are two parties to obligation. And everything what God had said to Abraham had happened. His son was born, and then God waited until Isaac became, although it's not in our lesson, I must mention that event. Isaac became a teenager and strong man, and God asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. That was real test of faith. And Abraham did everything what God said to him, didn't question at all. So my point is, he didn't stay at that level of doubting, will ever God fulfill his promise? He grew up in his faith.
You've got to understand too, it was his only son.
Yes,
That's right. It's like with God, his son.
but when we read Hebrews and so on, this is long after Abraham has passed away. Paul says that he believed that God is able to raise Isaac from the dead.
Isaac was too, because Isaac could have fought his father and gone on it. So Isaac had to believe too.
Yeah. But you are correct. I mean, I don't want to question the correctness of that. But how I would say, you can, I can imagine, because God gave us son as well, what would take, and not just son, we had two daughters. And if, for example, son is gone, you have something to fall back on. And you, but that was his only son. The other had dispute with, mother of that child had dispute with Sarah. And Sarah suggested to Abraham to let the bondwoman go, Hagar. And Abraham, as he was a good parent, he didn't want to renege on his responsibility as a parent. And he waited until God told him, listen to what your wife is saying to you. And God took care of Hagar and her son as well. So God took responsibility, and mind you, when Abraham was buried, who came to his funeral? Isaac, definitely, but Ishmael as well. So they knew which God Abraham worshipped, and they were quite okay with that, because even Hagar, as an Egyptian woman and foreigner to the promises of God, also learned about him while living in Abraham's household. And that is one of the points which God later emphasized, covenant obligations.
It wasn't only about Abraham, it was about the nations that were going to come.
Yep.
That was what Abraham was considering, when God was talking to him. What will be the results of those nations that come from?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Abraham was a man, and he had one son. And that son had two sons, Esau and Jacob. And Esau seems to me that he didn't like very much the restriction the God's commandment put on people, like covenant obligations. He didn't like those obligations. And so it says that Esau married from the people living around. And how many wives did he have? 2. And they made a very hard life for Isaac and his wife Rebekah. I mean, their other son didn't fare much better. He went back to relatives and married there. And he wanted to marry one girl, but his future father-in-law tricked him. And probably he thought, I tricked my brother, so I have to bear this burden. And eventually he finished up with 4 women and 12 sons and 1 daughter. I'm sorry? No, okay. But I would stress this verse from our final part of the lesson. For I know him, says the Lord, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he had spoken of him. Again, that idea of covenant. He expected, God promised him impossible things. Was it possible for, in today's time, many things which were impossible before became possible. You know, even in the field of artificial insemination, they can help old women or women who never can have children to have some success. But in those ages, such things were unthinkable of. If someone during her normal age, within, from teenager years to the menopause, cannot have a child, she will not have child after. Not unless God says you will have a child. And then he makes possible for that to happen. And mind you, the other thing, what we have to think about promise to Abraham is where Jesus' lineage comes from. It comes through David, but it also goes through Abraham. You read Luke version of event when he goes back to the Adam as a first man, because Matthew finishes before then, but Luke goes every step way back to Adam. And we see that through Abraham's seed the Messiah came, because Abraham's son was Isaac, and Isaac's son was Jacob, and Jacob's son was Judah. And through tribe of Judah, Jesus came.
Let's plan for Abraham to
And now we are only 5 minutes, I believe, till we have to finish. We have to consider this everlasting part. Why is it important that God's covenant is everlasting? Maybe the question is pretty simple.
If God withdraws his part of the deal, the entire human race is in a lot of trouble.
How long does God live? Forever. It says that his ages will not pass away. So one of the aspects is that one party to the covenant is everlasting. Therefore, God, being everlasting God, keeps his side of the covenant, and therefore the covenant is everlasting.
Like that 6,000 years like a twinkling of an eye to him.
Yeah, yeah. The covenant given in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve sinned is still everlasting covenant. The part of the covenant which God repeated to Noah is also part of that covenant, because God could have destroyed whole earth in times of Noah, yet Noah found a grace in his sight. And again, after all people were scattered after the Babylon, where the languages were mixed, if God didn't intervene and called Abraham out of the of Chaldeans, he would have maybe worshipped Marduk or some other gods, or his descendants. But for Abraham, God was able to testify that he will command his household after him to keep all the commandments of God. And this brings us to the question, did Abraham know the commandments of God? Many people in Christian world today say, Mount Sinai, that's where the commandments of God were given. But basically, it's not true. It's not true. If you read the Bible, especially what it says about Abraham, he kept all God's commandments. He kept all God's commandments. And it's quite interesting that we see the life of Joseph in Egypt land, and that he was a slave in a house of Potiphar. And probably in those days, like in these days, it's nothing unusual that to have people pay in most random ways. And Potiphar's wife was very keen to get on with Joseph. But Joseph refused her and said, how would I do such a gross thing and sin against God? How did he know? Must be that his father told him. Must be that his granddad told him. Must be that So everyone who is clinging on to idea that God's law only started from Sinai is on very shaky ground. Why I'm saying this? Because you will be talking to people who will promote those ideas. And I've talked to many people who claim, Old Testament was only about law, but this New Testament is all about grace. And we say, no, grace was in the Old Testament, and law is in the New Testament as well. And it messes them up.
All you got to do is just read it.
Yeah. It's simple.
And if there wasn't the law of God, then we wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. I mean, how many times did people come to Jesus and ask him, what should I do to inherit the eternal life? And never Jesus said to them or dismissed them, go away. But always treated that question with the utmost preciseness. And answer was approximately in this: keep the commandments. He could have said, if his death was on the cross to abolish the law, he would have just said, wait for a few years and then you don't need to do anything. You just believe in me and that's enough.
Commandments are a law of love.
So now we are asking what, yeah, there is.
Then about 10 commandments, how we not look to the 10 commandments, how we know we keep them, how we know we are sinners and we depend on Jesus' salvation. Without 10 commandments, it's impossible to accept Jesus' salvation.
Yeah. If I say I believe that I should not steal, but I go and put in my pocket something what doesn't belong to me and without the knowledge of true owner, what I believe, am I confused or I'm saying what I believe? And every other commandment could be reasoned off with the same way. Do you like your neighbor to be stealing from you, or do you like your wife to be fair game for anyone who comes, or do you like someone to testify falsely for you in courts and so on? And everybody would frighten and say, no, but that is part of God's commandment.
Commandments are totally linked together.
Yeah.
Take one away from it, takes it.
So our lesson is asking us to discuss the link between faith and deeds. So are they linked? Abraham's life is perfect example where his deeds matched his faith. Not always 100%, but when he sinned, he repented. And then the rest of his life was unwavering faith in what God had said. Didn't matter because he didn't have running water in his tent. And he lived pretty long life, I think 185. That means he lived in tents for 110 years. How about that? Why? Because he saw the New Jerusalem. And he trusted that God is going to fulfill his promise. And I believe that this lesson is opportunity for us to compare our faith with Abraham's faith and our lives with his life. And God is ready to promise us exactly the same because the covenant is everlasting. The same thing, New Jerusalem, if we have faith in him. I thank you for your patience, and I went a little bit over time, but this is okay. Thank you.